When a billionaire CEO's empire is crashing, the last person she calls is a small-town mechanic. But sometimes desperation makes the most unlikely allies. Frank Mitchell never imagined he'd find himself in a corporate boardroom wearing a dead man's suit about to tell the biggest lie of his life. But here he is face-to-face with Colorado's most ruthless business leaders pretending to be engaged to a woman he barely knows. At 58, Frank has spent 3 years rebuilding his life after losing his son Tommy in Afghanistan. Now it's just him and 10-year-old Emma running the family auto repair shop that's been in the Mitchell family for 3 generations. Frank lives by simple rules: work hard, treat people fairly, and never compromise your integrity no matter the cost. But when Victoria Sterling's car breaks down outside his garage on a stormy night, Frank's quiet life is about to explode. She's hiding her identity as the CEO of a $500 million company under siege by enemies who want to destroy everything she and her late husband built. What starts as helping a stranded stranger becomes the most dangerous gamble of Frank's life. Soon he's playing the role of devoted fiancé to save Victoria's company. But when fake feelings turn real and powerful enemies strike back, Frank must choose between the safe life he's built and a love that could cost him everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor of Mitchell's auto repair pair as Frank Mitchell wiped his hands on a well-worn shop rag. At 58, his weathered face told the story of a man who had earned every line through honest work and genuine worry. The garage had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Mitchells who understood that a man's reputation was built one satisfied customer at a time. "Grandpa Frank, you've got coffee on your shirt again," 10-year-old Emma called from her makeshift homework station in the corner, where she'd arranged school books around a small desk Frank had built from spare parts. Frank looked down at the brown stains spreading across his blue work shirt and chuckled. "Good eye, kiddo. Remind me why I keep you around here." "Because I'm the only one who remembers where you put your reading glasses," Emma replied without looking up from her math worksheet, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she worked through long division problems that would have challenged kids twice her age. The easy banter between them masked a deeper truth that both understood but rarely discussed. Emma had been living with Frank for 3 years now, ever since her father Frank's only son Tommy had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan. The little girl who had once visited the garage on weekends and holidays had become his whole world overnight, and Frank had discovered that being a grandfather was somehow both easier and harder than being a father had been. "Mrs. Patterson's Honda is ready," Frank announced, making a note in his appointment book. "That makes 4 repairs this week. Not bad for January." Emma nodded seriously as if she understood the weight of those numbers. In many ways she did. She'd learned to read the rhythm of the garage business. Busy weeks meant dinner out at the diner. Slow weeks meant grilled cheese and tomato soup at home. She never complained about either, which broke Frank's heart and made him proud in equal measure. The bell above the front door chimed, and Frank looked up to see Bob Chen, who owned the hardware store 3 blocks down. Bob's ancient pickup truck had been a regular customer for the past decade. "Morning, Bob. Don't tell me the old Ford is acting up again." "Actually, she's running like a dream," Bob said, pulling out his wallet. "I came to settle up for last month's work and to ask if you've given any more thought to selling this place." Frank's expression hardened slightly. "I told you, Bob, the garage isn't for sale." I know, but that developer's offer is going up every month. He's bought out half the block already." Bob counted out bills slowly. "Sarah and I are thinking seriously about taking his money for the hardware store. We could retire comfortable, maybe move closer to our daughter in Phoenix." Emma looked up from her homework, her green eyes so much like her father's, flicking between the two men. She'd heard variations of this conversation before, always with Frank giving the same answer. "This garage has been in my family for 60 years, Frank said quietly. "My father built his reputation here, I built mine here, and someday, maybe Emma will build hers here. There's more to life than money, Bob." Bob nodded respectfully. "I hear you, Frank. I really do. But that little girl deserves every opportunity, and Denver's getting expensive. College tuition alone." He let the thought hang in the air. After Bob left, Frank returned to the engine he'd been working on, a timing belt replacement on a 10-year-old Subaru. The work was methodical and familiar, requiring the kind of attention that kept his mind from wandering to uncomfortable places. But Emma's voice cut through his concentration. "Grandpa Frank, are we poor?" Frank straightened up, his back protesting the sudden movement. At 10, Emma was old enough to understand more than he sometimes gave her credit for, but young enough that the world still seemed like a place where problems had clear solutions. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart? Kids at school talk about stuff their parents buy them. New phones, vacations, private tutoring." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, not envious. "And I heard you talking to Mrs. Nelson about Emma's college fund last week." Mrs. Nelson was the family attorney who had helped Frank navigate the paperwork when Emma came to live with him. She was also the one who occasionally reminded him that his current savings rate wouldn't cover 4 years at a decent university. Frank wiped his hands again and walked over to Emma's desk. He pulled up a folding chair, another of his homemade creations, and sat down beside her. "Emma, let me tell you something my father told me when I was about your age. He said there are two kinds of rich in this world. There's having money and there's having what money can't buy." Frank gestured around the garage. "We've got a roof over our heads, food on the table, and each other. Most importantly, we've got our integrity. That means doing the right thing even when no one's watching, keeping our word, even when it costs us, and treating people fairly no matter what they can do for us." Emma considered this seriously. "But college costs money. Real money." "It does, and we'll figure that out when the time comes. Maybe you'll earn scholarships, you're certainly smart enough. Maybe I'll take on more work. Maybe something else will come along that we haven't thought of yet." Frank smoothed her hair. "The point is, we don't compromise who we are to solve our problems. Your dad understood that. It's why he joined the Army, not because we needed the money, but because he believed in serving something bigger than himself." Emma nodded, returning to her math problems with the focused determination that reminded Frank so much of Tommy at that age. His son had approached everything from homework to auto mechanics to military service with the same steady resolve. The afternoon brought two more customers, a oil change for the Methodist minister's sedan, and a diagnostic check for Maria Santos, who cleaned offices downtown and couldn't afford to have her car break down. Frank charged the minister full price and Maria half price, a business practice that would have horrified any accountant but made perfect sense to Frank's moral compass. As closing time approached, Frank tallied the day's receipts while Emma packed her school supplies into her backpack. The numbers were what they always were, enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table, with a little left over for Emma's college fund if nothing major broke down in the apartment upstairs. "What's for dinner?" Emma asked, zipping up her backpack. "How about we walk down to Rosie's Diner? It's been a good day, and I think we deserve to celebrate." Emma's face lit up. Dinner at Rosie's was a special occasion reserved for particularly good days or particularly hard ones. Either way, it meant Frank wanted to spend an hour focusing entirely on her instead of splitting his attention between conversation and cooking. As they walked the 3 blocks to the diner, Emma slipped her small hand into Frank's calloused one. The evening air carried the scent of snow, unusual for Denver in January, but not unheard of. Street lights were beginning to flicker on, and the neighborhood was settling into the quiet rhythm of working families heading home. "Grandpa Frank," Emma said as they approached Rosie's familiar neon sign. "Yeah, kiddo. I'm glad we're not the rich kind of rich. I like our life." Frank squeezed her hand gently. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Neither of them could have predicted that within 24 hours, their quiet, predictable life would intersect with a world of wealth and power they'd only seen in movies. And neither could have imagined that a simple act of kindness on a dark, rainy night would set in motion events that would challenge everything Frank believed about integrity, family, and what it truly meant to be rich. But that was still a day away. For now, there was just a grandfather and his granddaughter sharing a burger and fries in a small-town diner, surrounded by the kind of honest contentment that money couldn't buy. The storm hit Denver just after midnight, bringing with it the kind of driving rain that turned streets into rivers and made even the most experienced drivers think twice about venturing out. Frank had been awakened by thunder that seemed to shake the small apartment above the garage, and after checking on Emma, who slept through everything with the enviable peace of childhood, he'd made himself a cup of coffee and settled in to listen to the weather. By morning, the worst had passed, leaving behind gray skies and the promise of more rain to come. Frank went through his usual routine breakfast with Emma, walking her to the school bus stop 6 blocks away and returning to open the garage for what looked like it would be a slow day. Bad weather was good for business. In some ways, people discovered problems they'd been ignoring when they had to drive in challenging conditions, but it also meant customers were less likely to venture out for routine maintenance. The first call came around 10 o'clock. Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick wouldn't start, and she needed to get to her daughter's house across town for a doctor's appointment. Frank loaded his portable jump starter and basic tools into his pickup truck and made the house call, spending an hour in the drizzle replacing a corroded battery terminal and explaining to Mrs. Henderson why she shouldn't feel embarrassed about not knowing how to check her engine oil. The second call was more complicated. Jim Reeves's delivery truck had broken down on the interstate, and Frank spent the better part of the afternoon replacing a blown radiator hose in a truck stop parking lot while 18-wheelers roared past in the rain. By the time he got back to the garage, it was nearly 6 o'clock, and he was soaked through despite his rain gear. Emma was waiting in her usual spot, homework spread across her desk, but she looked up with concern when Frank walked in dripping rainwater. "You look like you fell in a lake," she observed. "Feel like it too," Frank replied, hanging his wet jacket on a hook near the door. "How was school?" "Good. I got 100 on my science test, and Mrs. Morrison said I should think about entering the district math competition next month." Emma's voice carried a note of pride mixed with uncertainty. She'd inherited her father's analytical mind, but she was still learning to believe in her own abilities. "That's fantastic, kiddo. Your dad would be proud." Frank changed into a dry shirt from the small closet where he kept spare clothes. "What do you think about the competition?" Emma. "I don't know. The other kids who enter usually go to private schools or have tutors. I just learn from you and Mrs. Morrison." "Sometimes that's the best kind of learning," Frank said. "When you have to figure things out for yourself, you really understand them. Like working on engines, you can read all the manuals in the world, but until you've actually had your hands in there fixing real problems, you don't really know what you're doing." Emma considered this, then nodded slowly. "Maybe I'll ask Mrs. Morrison for the application." "That's my girl. Always worth trying, even if you're not sure how it'll turn out." Frank was finishing up the paperwork from the day's calls when the phone rang. He almost didn't answer. It was after 7, and he'd already locked the front door, but something about the persistence of the ringing made him pick up. "Mitchell's Auto Repair, this is Frank." "Oh, thank God someone answered." The voice was female-strained and carried the kind of educated accent that Frank associated with the wealthy neighborhoods on the other side of town. "I'm so sorry to call so late, but I'm stranded, and I saw your sign through the rain. Are you still open?" Frank looked through the front window into the dark street. He could see headlights about a block away, hazard lights blinking in the rain. "Where exactly are you, ma'am?" I'm not entirely sure. I was trying to take a shortcut, and I think I'm lost. My car just died, and my phone's almost dead, and I don't know who else to call." There was real fear in her voice now, the kind that came from being alone and vulnerable in an unfamiliar place. Frank grabbed his keys and rain jacket. "Stay right where you are. I can see your hazard lights. I'll be there in 2 minutes." "Grandpa Frank," Emma looked up from her homework with concern. "Someone's broken down right outside. I'll just be a minute." Frank paused at the door. "Lock this behind me, okay? And if I'm not back in 10 minutes, you call Mrs. Patterson next door." The rain had picked up again, turning the short walk into a near sprint. As Frank approached the stranded vehicle, he could see it was expensive, some kind of European sedan that probably cost more than Frank made in 2 years. The woman behind the wheel was talking rapidly on a cell phone, her free hand gesturing emphatically, even though whoever she was talking to couldn't see her. Frank tapped gently on the driver's side window, and the woman looked up with startled blue eyes. She was probably in her mid-40s with shoulder-length brown hair that suggested regular appointments at the kind of salon Frank had never set foot in. Even through the rain-streaked glass, he could see she'd been crying. She rolled down the window a few inches, still clutching her phone. "Are you the mechanic I called?" "Frank Mitchell," he said, touching the brim of his baseball cap. "What seems to be the problem?" "I don't know. It just stopped, right in the middle of the street. The lights on the dashboard are flashing, and there's the beeping sound, and I don't know anything about cars." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. Frank noticed she was wearing what looked like a cocktail dress under a designer coat, and her shoes were completely impractical for walking anywhere, let alone standing in the rain. Whatever had brought her to this part of town, she hadn't planned for it. "Let me take a look," Frank said. "But first, let's get you out of the rain. Can you pop the hood for me?" The problem was obvious the moment Frank lifted the hood. The alternator belt had snapped, probably due to wear and the stress of the sudden weather change. It was the kind of repair that would take 15 minutes if he had the right part, but the belt would need to be ordered and nothing would be open until morning. He walked back to the driver's window where the woman was now shivering despite her coat. "Good news and bad news," Frank said. "Good news is it's an easy fix. Bad news is I don't have the part you need and you're not driving anywhere tonight." The woman's face crumpled. "I can't. I don't have anywhere." She stopped herself, visibly trying to regain composure. "I mean, I can call someone. I just need to figure out who." Frank studied her for a moment. Everything about her suggested wealth and privilege, but something in her voice spoke of genuine desperation. More importantly, she was soaked cold and stranded in a part of town where a woman alone at night wasn't entirely safe. "Look, miss." "Vicky," she said quickly. "Just Vicky." "Vicky, I can't fix your car tonight, but I can't leave you sitting here either. My garage is just down the block. You can come inside, get warm, charge your phone, and figure out your next move. My granddaughter's there doing homework, so you'll have a proper chaperone." Vicky stared at him for a long moment, and Frank could see her weighing her options. Trust a stranger or spend the night in a broken-down car in an unfamiliar neighborhood. "You don't even know me," she said finally. "No, ma'am, I don't. But I know what's right, and leaving someone stranded in this weather isn't right." Something in her expression shifted, surprise, maybe, or relief. Thank you. That's very kind." Frank helped her gather her purse and lock the car, then offered his arm as they walked the slippery block back to the garage. She stumbled twice in her impractical shoes, and Frank found himself wondering what kind of evening she'd been dressed for and why it had ended with her alone and lost in the rain. Emma looked up with curiosity as they entered the garage, taking in their unexpected guest with a frank assessment of childhood. "Emma, this is Miss Vicky. Her car broke down, and she's going to wait here until she can arrange for someone to pick her up." Emma nodded seriously. "Hi, Miss Vicky. Do you want some hot chocolate? Grandpa Frank makes really good hot chocolate." For the first time since Frank had met her, Vicky smiled genuinely. "That sounds wonderful." As Frank busied himself with the hot chocolate, a skill learned during countless cold mornings, when Emma needed warming up before school, he watched Vicky settle into the spare chair near Emma's desk. She seemed to relax slightly in the warm, well-lit space, though she kept checking her phone with increasing frustration. "No signal?" Frank asked, handing her a steaming mug. "It's not that, it's just—" Vicky paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It's complicated." Emma, with the directness of youth, asked, "Are you in trouble?" Vicky looked startled by the question, then laughed a sound that was half amusement, half exhaustion. "You know what? Yes, I think I am in trouble. Not the kind where you call the police," she added quickly, seeing Frank's expression. "Just life trouble." "Grandpa Frank says life trouble usually works itself out if you're patient and do the right thing," Emma offered. "Does he?" Vicky looked at Frank with something that might have been envy. "That sounds like a nice way to live." Frank handed Emma her own mug of hot chocolate. "It's not always easy, but it's usually simple. Right is right, wrong is wrong, and most of the time the choice is clearer than people want to admit." Vicky sipped her hot chocolate, studying at Frank over the rim of her mug. "You really believe that?" "I do. My father taught me that a man's word is his bond, and that you judge people by what they do when no one's watching. Served me well for 58 years. And if doing the right thing costs you everything—" The question was asked quietly, but Frank heard the real pain behind it. Whatever had brought Vicky to his garage tonight, it wasn't just a broken alternator belt. "Then you still do the right thing," Frank said simply, "because if you compromise your integrity to solve a problem, you haven't really solved anything. You've just created a different kind of problem." Vicky stared into her hot chocolate for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that tonight." Before Frank could respond, Vicky's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She glanced at the screen and her entire demeanor changed, shoulders tensing, jaw tightening. "I have to take this," she said, stepping toward the front door for privacy. Frank couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see Vicky through the window, pacing back and forth in the rain, her free hand gesturing emphatically. Whatever she was discussing, it wasn't going well. When she returned, she looked exhausted, but more composed. "I've arranged for someone to pick me up," she said. "They'll be here in about 20 minutes. "Good," Frank said. "In the meantime, you just sit tight and stay warm." As they waited, Emma chatted easily with Vicky about school, her math competition, and her favorite books. Frank found himself impressed by how naturally Vicky engaged with his granddaughter, asking thoughtful questions, sharing her own memories of school competitions, treating Emma like a person worthy of genuine conversation, rather than just a child to be tolerated. When headlights finally appeared outside, Vicky stood with obvious reluctance. "Thank you," she said to Frank, pressing a folded bill into his hand. "For everything. You probably saved my life tonight." Frank looked down at the money, $100 bill, and immediately tried to hand it back. "Ma'am, I can't accept this. I didn't do anything that any decent person wouldn't do." "Please," Vicky said, backing toward the door. "For Emma's college fund. Someone that smart deserves every opportunity." Before Frank could protest further, she was out the door and climbing into the back of a black sedan that looked like it belonged to a car service. Frank watched through the window as the car pulled away, taking their mysterious visitor back to whatever world she'd emerged from. "I liked her," Emma announced, returning to her homework. "Yeah," Frank said, still holding the $100 bill and wondering if he'd ever see Vicky again. "I did too." Neither of them noticed the small gold bracelet that had fallen beneath Emma's desk, nor could they have imagined that finding it would lead to discoveries that would change their understanding of kindness, wealth, and what it truly meant to help someone in need. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 3 days passed before Frank discovered the bracelet. He was cleaning the garage on Saturday morning, a weekly ritual that Emma helped with by organizing the small parts bins and wiping down tools when something glinted beneath her desk. "What's this?" Frank asked, holding up the delicate gold chain. Emma looked over from where she was arranging wrenches by size. "Oh, that must be Miss Vicky's. I saw her wearing it when she was here." Frank examined the bracelet more closely. It was clearly expensive, with what looked like real diamonds set in an intricate pattern, and there was an engraving on the back, V.S. "With all my love, Richard." The craftsmanship was the kind that spoke of serious money, the type of jewelry Frank had only seen in store windows when he occasionally walked through the upscale shopping district downtown. "We should return it," Emma said matter-of-factly. "She's probably looking for it." Frank nodded but realized he had no way to contact Vicky. She'd never given him a last name or phone number, and while he could describe the car that had picked her up, that hardly seemed like enough information to track down someone in a city the size of Denver. "I'll put it in the safe for now," Frank decided. Maybe she'll come back for her car. But Vicky's European sedan had been towed away Friday morning by a service truck with no company markings, leaving only an oil stain on the street to show it had ever been there. Frank had watched from the garage window as two men in coveralls loaded the car onto the truck with professional efficiency, wondering if he'd ever get the chance to properly fix the alternator belt. The answer came Monday afternoon when Emma burst through the garage door with her usual post-school energy and an unusual level of excitement. "Grandpa Frank, you'll never guess what happened at school today." Frank looked up from the transmission he was rebuilding, a job that required concentration and steady hands, both of which were improved by Emma's cheerful chatter. "What's got you so worked up, kiddo?" "Mrs. Morrison showed us this magazine article about successful women in business, and Miss Vicky was in it." Emma rummaged through her backpack and pulled out a glossy magazine that looked like it belonged in a corporate waiting room rather than a fourth-grade classroom. Frank wiped his hands and accepted the magazine, which was open to a spread titled "Colorado's Most Powerful Women," and there, smiling from a professional photograph that had probably cost more than Frank's monthly rent, was their mysterious visitor from 3 nights ago. Except she wasn't Miss Vicky at all. "Victoria Sterling," Frank read aloud, scanning the article. "Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Industries, one of Colorado's largest automotive parts manufacturers. Following the death of her husband, Richard Sterling Jr., 2 years ago, Victoria has led the company through a period of unprecedented growth while maintaining its reputation for quality and innovation." The article went on to detail Victoria Sterling's business accomplishments, her philanthropic work, and her estimated net worth of $500 million. There were quotes about leadership challenges, mentions of a Harvard MBA, and references to board meetings and corporate strategies that might as well have been written in a foreign language, for all Frank understood of that world. But what struck him most was the photograph itself. The woman in the picture looked confident, polished, completely in control, nothing like the frightened, desperate person who had sat in his garage 3 nights ago, clutching a mug of hot chocolate and looking like her world was falling apart. Frank said slowly, do you remember what Miss Vicky said when you asked if she was in trouble? She said yes, but not the kind where you call the police. Life trouble. Emma climbed onto her usual stool. Why is she really famous? Frank reread portions of the article, trying to reconcile the powerful executive described in the magazine with the vulnerable woman who had accepted his help so gratefully. According to the business publication, Victoria Sterling was known for her fierce independence, her strategic brilliance, and her ability to outmaneuver competitors who underestimated her. None of that explained why she'd been driving alone through a rough neighborhood at night, dressed for an upscale event, or why she'd seemed so genuinely desperate when her car broke down. Grandpa Frank, you're making that face you make when you're trying to figure out how to fix something complicated. Frank looked up to find Emma studying him with the perceptive attention that sometimes reminded him uncomfortably of how much she'd inherited from her father's analytical mind. I'm just trying to understand why someone that successful would be driving through our neighborhood alone at night, Frank admitted. Doesn't make much sense. Emma considered this seriously. Maybe she was trying to get away from something, or someone. The insight was more perceptive than Frank would have expected from a 10-year-old, and it opened up possibilities he hadn't considered. What kind of trouble would drive a woman worth $500 million to seek refuge in a neighborhood garage? What kind of desperation would make someone accustomed to private cars and professional drivers end up stranded on a dark street in the rain? Frank's speculation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up outside. Through the window, he could see a sleek black SUV with tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that suggested serious money and possibly serious security concerns. Stay here, Frank told Emma, moving toward the front door. Victoria Sterling emerged from the passenger side of the SUV, and Frank was struck again by the transformation. Gone was the desperate woman from 3 nights ago, replaced by someone who looked every inch the successful executive from the magazine photo. She wore a tailored business suit, her hair was perfectly styled, and she moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. But when their eyes met through the glass door, Frank saw something that hadn't changed the genuine warmth and gratitude that had marked their first meeting. The SUV's driver remained behind the wheel as Victoria approached the garage. Frank opened the door before she could knock. Mrs. Sterling, he said, offering a slight nod that acknowledged both her status and his awareness of it. She paused clearly, surprised that he knew her real name. You figured it out. Emma found your picture in a magazine at school. Quite a difference between Miss Vicky and Victoria Sterling's CEO. Victoria's composure faltered slightly. I suppose I owe you an explanation. You don't owe me anything, Frank replied, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. Would you like to come in? Victoria glanced back at the SUV where Frank could see the driver speaking into a cell phone. I can only stay a few minutes. My security detail gets nervous when I deviate from the schedule. Emma's face lit up when Victoria entered the garage. Mrs. Sterling, I saw your picture in Mrs. Morrison's magazine. Hello, Emma, Victoria said, her professional facade softening immediately. I hope you didn't think I was lying to you the other night. Were you? Emma asked with characteristic directness. Victoria considered the question seriously. I was trying not to lie while also not telling the whole truth. It's a skill you learn in business, but it's not very admirable. Frank found himself respecting her honesty. Emma, why don't you work on your homework while Mrs. Sterling and I talk? Once Emma had settled at her desk with her books, Victoria turned to Frank with an expression that mixed embarrassment with determination. I came to thank you properly, she said, and to apologize for the deception. When I told you my name was Vicky, it wasn't entirely false. My friends call me Vicky, but I was also hiding from who I really am. Why? Victoria looked around the garage, taking in the honest tools, the straightforward organization, the absence of pretense. When you're Victoria Sterling CEO, every interaction is calculated. People want something from you, a bomb, an investment, a favor, access to other wealthy people. You learn to be suspicious of everyone's motives, to look for the angle, to wonder what someone really wants. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. But when I was just Vicky, stranded and vulnerable, you helped me because it was the right thing to do. You didn't know I could make your problems disappear with a phone call. You didn't know I could write a check that would set Emma up for life. You just saw someone who needed help and you provided it. Frank nodded slowly. So the other night when you were asking about doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything, I'm facing some challenges at the company. People who think a widow shouldn't be running a $500 million business. People who believe that a woman who makes emotional decisions like helping employees during family crises or maintaining expensive safety standards isn't fit to lead. Victoria's voice carried a bitterness that hadn't been there 3 nights ago. My husband's uncle Harrison Sterling has been particularly vocal about my supposed shortcomings. Emma looked up from her homework. That doesn't sound fair. It isn't fair, sweetheart, Victoria agreed. But fairness isn't always how the business world works. Frank leaned against his workbench, studying Victoria's face. What kind of challenges are we talking about? The board of directors is meeting next week to discuss my leadership. Harrison has convinced several members that I'm too unstable, too emotional, too focused on what he calls bleeding heart policies to run the company effectively. Victoria's hands clenched slightly as she spoke. He's been documenting every decision I've made that prioritizes people over pure profit. And the other night, I was driving back from a dinner meeting with board members who I thought were allies. It didn't go well. They suggested that my judgment has been compromised by grief, that I'm making decisions based on emotion rather than business logic. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. I was so angry and hurt that I couldn't face going home to my empty house. I started driving with no destination in mind, just trying to process what I'd heard. Frank was beginning to understand the desperation he'd seen in her that night. So you ended up in our neighborhood. Lost and broken down, yes, but also lost in a larger sense. I've spent 2 years trying to prove that I can run Richard's company as well as he did, maybe better. But every time I try to maintain the values that made Sterling Industries special, treating employees fairly, maintaining quality, even when it's expensive, investing in community programs, Harrison tells the board that I'm being weak. Emma had abandoned any pretense of doing homework and was listening with the absorbed attention she usually reserved for Frank's stories about her father. Why don't you just fire the mean uncle? Victoria smiled sadly. I wish it were that simple. Harrison owns 15% of the company, and he has influence with other major shareholders. If I move against him directly, he'll claim I'm being vindictive and emotional, exactly what he's already saying. What happens if the board decides against you? Frank asked. They could remove me as CEO. Harrison has been pushing for exactly that outcome, suggesting that I should step down for the good of the company and accept a figurehead role while he takes over actual operations. Victoria's jaw tightened. He's been very careful to frame it as concern for my well-being and the company's future. Frank studied her face, seeing the pain behind the composed exterior. You think he's been planning this since your husband died? I know he has. Richard and Harrison never got along. Harrison thought the company should be purely profit-driven, while Richard believed in balancing success with social responsibility. When Richard died, Harrison saw an opportunity to reshape Sterling Industries according to his vision. But you're not going to let that happen, Emma said, with the confidence of someone who had grown up believing that good people always found a way to win. Victoria looked at Emma with something approaching wonder. You know what? You're right. I'm not going to let that happen. I just need to figure out how to prove that my approach to leadership isn't weakness, it's strength. Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold bracelet. Before you do anything else, you should probably have this back. Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her wrist. I've been looking everywhere for this. It was Richard's last gift to me before he got sick. As she fastened the bracelet around her wrist, Frank noticed that her hands were trembling slightly. The controlled executive facade was cracking again, revealing the grieving widow underneath. Mrs. Sterling, Frank said gently, I don't know much about corporate politics, but I know something about fighting for what matters. If you built this company with your husband, if you've been running it successfully for 2 years, If you're maintaining values that you both believed in, then you're not the problem. The people trying to undermine you are. Victoria looked up at him with tears in her eyes. You make it sound so simple. Truth usually is simple. It's the lies that get complicated. Outside, the SUV's horn honked twice, apparently a signal that Victoria's schedule was getting tight. I have to go, Victoria said reluctantly. But Frank, may I ask you something? Of course. The other night when you helped me, you didn't know who I was or what I could do for you in return. If you had known, would you have acted differently? Frank considered the question seriously. No, help is help, regardless of who needs it. And honestly, knowing who you are now doesn't change my opinion of you. You were a person in trouble and you handled yourself with dignity. That matters more than money or titles. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, then impulsively reached out and squeezed his hand. Thank you for everything. For reminding me that there are still people in the world who do the right thing simply because it's right. As the SUV pulled away, Emma moved to stand beside Frank at the window. She's really sad, isn't she? Emma observed. Yeah, kiddo, I think she is. But she's also really strong like Dad was. Frank looked down at his granddaughter once again, amazed by her insight. You're right. She reminds me of your dad in some ways. Both of them trying to do the right thing even when it's difficult. Neither of them could have predicted that within a week Victoria Sterling would return with a proposal that would test everything Frank believed about right and wrong, about the price of integrity, and about what a man would do to secure his granddaughter's future. But for now, there was just the memory of genuine gratitude in Victoria's eyes, and the growing understanding that sometimes the most important help you can give someone isn't fixing their car, it's reminding them who they really are. The following Tuesday, Victoria Sterling returned to Mitchell's Auto Repair under circumstances that were both more ordinary and more surprising than her previous visits. She arrived not in a corporate SUV with security detail, but driving a modest Honda Civic that looked like it had seen better days. Frank was working on a brake job when he heard the familiar chime of the front door. He looked up to see Victoria dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger and somehow more approachable. Mrs. Sterling, Frank said, wiping his hands on his work rag. This is unexpected. Please call me Vicky, she said, glancing around the garage with what seemed like genuine interest rather than the polite attention of her previous visit. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in the neighborhood and I thought... She gestured toward the Honda. Well, honestly, I need your professional opinion. Emma looked up from her after-school snack of apple slices and peanut butter. Hi, Vicky. Is that your car? Victoria laughed, and Frank noticed how much more relaxed she seemed away from the corporate environment. It is now. I bought it yesterday from a used car lot. The salesman assured me it was a steal, which I'm beginning to suspect might have been more accurate than he intended. Frank walked around the Honda, noting the small dents in the bodywork, the slightly mismatched paint on the rear bumper, and the way the engine sounded when Victoria had pulled up. What made you decide to buy a 15-year-old Civic? I wanted something anonymous, Victoria said, running her hand along the car's roof. Something that would let me drive around the city without being recognized or followed. As it turns out, when you're known for driving luxury vehicles, a Honda Civic is better camouflage than I could have imagined. Emma had abandoned her snack and joined them beside the car. It's like a disguise. Exactly like a disguise, Victoria agreed, crouching down to Emma's level. Sometimes it's nice to be just another person running errands instead of Victoria Sterling, CEO. Frank popped the hood and immediately saw several issues that explained why the car had been a steal. Well, the good news is that it runs. The bad news is that it needs about $800 worth of work to run well. Victoria's face fell slightly. I was afraid of that. The salesman said it just needed an oil change. The salesman said a lot of things, I'm guessing, Frank replied dryly. Let me show you what we're dealing with. For the next 20 minutes, Frank walked Victoria through the car's various problems, explaining each issue in terms that were technical enough to be accurate, but simple enough for someone without automotive knowledge to understand. He pointed out the worn brake pads, the leaking valve cover gasket, the frayed serpentine belt, and the air filter that looked like it hadn't been changed since the Clinton administration. What impressed him was how seriously Victoria listened, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on her phone. This wasn't someone having car problems explained to her. This was someone learning about car maintenance. So if I wanted to fix everything you've identified, what would that cost? Victoria asked. Frank did some quick mental math. Parts and labor probably 750 to 800, but you don't need to do it all at once. We could prioritize the safety issues, first brakes and belts, and handle the rest over the next few months. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. What would you recommend? Honestly, for what you probably paid for this car, you could buy something in better condition. But if you want to keep it, Frank shrugged. It's a Honda. Fix the problems, maintain it properly, and it'll run for another 100,000 miles. I want to keep it, Victoria said firmly, and I want you to fix it. All of it. Frank was about to explain his scheduling and give her an estimate on timing when Emma spoke up. Can I help? She asked, looking between Frank and Victoria with excitement. I know how to organize parts and hold flashlights, and Grandpa Frank says I'm good at spotting things that don't look right. Victoria's face lit up. I would love your help, Emma, but only if your grandfather thinks it's appropriate. Frank found himself smiling at the interaction. I think we can arrange something, but it'll take a few sessions to get everything done, probably spread over a couple weeks. Perfect, Victoria said. When can we start? And so began what Emma would later describe as the most fun project ever. 3 afternoons a week, Victoria would arrive at the garage after picking Emma up from school, and the three of them would work on the Honda together. Victoria proved to be a surprisingly apt student, showing the same focused intelligence in learning about automotive repair that had presumably made her successful in business. Frank started with basic concepts: how engines work, why oil changes matter, what different warning lights mean, and found that Victoria absorbed information quickly and asked insightful questions. Emma served as both assistant and translator, explaining Frank's more technical comments in terms that Victoria could understand, and helping Victoria with tasks that required smaller hands or greater flexibility. Why does this matter? Victoria asked one afternoon as Frank showed her how to check tire pressure. I mean, I understand that properly inflated tires are safer, but why is it important for me to know how to check them myself? Emma answered before Frank could. Because if you know how things work, you can tell when they're not working right. And you can't get fooled by people who think you don't know anything. Victoria looked at Emma with surprise, then at Frank with something approaching awe. That's actually profound life advice disguised as car maintenance. Emma's full of wisdom, Frank said proudly. She gets it from her father. As the days passed, Frank began to understand that Victoria's interest in learning car repair went beyond simple vehicle maintenance. She talked about feeling disconnected from the practical aspects of life, about spending her days in meetings and conference calls, discussing abstract business concepts, while never actually making anything or fixing anything with her own hands. In business school, they teach you to think strategically, to delegate operational details to other people. Victoria explained one afternoon as she struggled to remove a stubborn oil filter. But I'm starting to think there's value in understanding how things actually work at the ground level. Frank guided her hands to the proper angle for the filter wrench. My father used to say that you can't really lead people if you don't understand the work they do. He might not have gone to Harvard, but he knew his business inside and out. Victoria finally loosened the filter, grinning with satisfaction. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Taught me that honest work is its own reward, and that you measure success by whether you can look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day. What would he think of someone like me? Victoria asked quietly. Someone who inherited wealth and position instead of earning it. Frank considered the question seriously. He'd judge you by what you do with what you've been given. From what I can see, you're trying to use your position to take care of people, your employees, your community. That's what matters. During these sessions, Frank learned more about Victoria's life and the challenges she faced at Sterling Industries. She talked about board meetings where she felt outnumbered and undermined, about employees who depended on her to maintain their jobs and benefits, about the constant pressure to choose between profitability and principles. Harrison keeps pushing for what he calls operational efficiency, Victoria said one afternoon as she changed the Honda's air filter under Frank's guidance. Longer hours, reduced benefits, outsourcing manufacturing to cheaper facilities overseas. He can show on paper how much money these changes would save. Emma looked up from where she was organizing the used parts. But what about the people who would lose their job? Exactly, Victoria said. Harrison's answer is that business isn't a charity, that our responsibility is to shareholders, not employees. But Richard and I always believe that you can't have a sustainable business without sustainable communities. Frank handed her a new filter. Sounds like you and your husband built something worth preserving. I hope so. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being naive, if the business world really is as cutthroat as Harrison claims. But then I meet people like you, and I remember that integrity isn't naive, it's just harder. And the conversations weren't all serious. Emma regaled Victoria with stories from school, particularly her preparation for the district math competition. Victoria, in turn, shared stories from her own childhood, describing a privileged but sometimes lonely upbringing that had taught her the value of genuine human connection. I was about your age when I realized that having money doesn't automatically make people interesting, Victoria told Emma one afternoon. Some of the most fascinating people I've known have been those who've had to work for everything they've achieved. Like Grandpa Frank, Emma said matter-of-factly. Exactly like Grandpa Frank. Frank felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the garage's heating system. It had been years since he'd experienced the easy camaraderie that was developing between the three of them, since Sarah had been alive really, and their small family had felt complete. The breakthrough moment came during their final work session when they were buttoning up the last of the Honda's repairs. Victoria had successfully replaced a headlight bulb, a simple task, but one that had required her to figure out the access panel and wire connections on her own. I did it, she announced with the pride of someone who had just climbed Mount Everest. Emma cheered, and Frank found himself grinning at Victoria's excitement. How does it feel? Like I actually accomplished something real, Victoria said, wiping her hands on the shop rag. Like I solved a problem with my own knowledge and effort instead of just writing a check or making a phone call. Frank started the Honda's engine, and they all listened to the smooth, quiet idle that was dramatically different from the rough, hesitant sound it had made when Victoria first brought it in. There's your reward, Frank said. A job well done. Victoria stared at the car for a moment, then turned to Frank with an expression of genuine gratitude. Thank you, both of you. This has been... I can't remember the last time I enjoyed learning something this much. Emma climbed into the passenger seat of the Honda. Can we go for a test drive? Emma, Frank started to protest, but Victoria was already nodding. Just around to block your eye, Victoria said. I want to see how it feels to drive something I helped fix. As they pulled out of the garage bay, Frank realized that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. Victoria was no longer the desperate stranger he'd helped on a rainy night, nor was she the powerful CEO he'd read about in magazines. She was simply Vicky, someone who had become improbably a friend. When they returned from the test drive, all three of them were laughing about Emma's commentary on Victoria's driving technique. You're being too gentle with the turns, Vicky. Cars like to know who's in charge. I should probably head home, Victoria said reluctantly as they pulled back into the garage. I have an early meeting tomorrow. About the board situation, Frank asked. Victoria's expression sobered. Actually, yes. Harrison called for a special meeting this Friday. He says he has concerns about recent developments that need to be addressed. Emma looked between the two adults, picking up on the sudden tension. Is that bad? I don't know yet, sweetheart, Victoria said honestly. But whatever happens, I want you both to know how much these past 2 weeks have meant to me. You've reminded me why I fell in love with this company in the first place. It's not about the money or the power, it's about building something that matters. Frank watched as Victoria gathered her purse and prepared to leave. Noting the way her shoulders seemed to carry a heavier burden than they had when she'd arrived that afternoon. Vicky, he said as she reached the door, whatever happens on Friday, remember what you told me about doing the right thing even when it's hard. You've got more integrity in your little finger than most people have in their whole body. Victoria smiled, but Frank could see the worry in her eyes. I hope integrity is enough. After she left, Emma helped Frank close up the garage for the evening. Grandpa Frank, Emma said as they climbed the stairs to their apartment, I really like Vicky. I do too, kiddo. I hope those mean people don't take her company away from her. Frank paused on the stairs, struck by the simple clarity of his granddaughter's perspective. In Emma's world, good people deserve good things, and bad people shouldn't be allowed to hurt them. It was a worldview that Frank had spent 58 years trying to maintain despite considerable evidence to the contrary. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Neither of them could have predicted that within 3 days, Victoria would return to their garage, not as a friend working on her car, but as someone whose world was crumbling around her, desperately in need of help, that would test every principle Frank had ever held and about integrity, family, and the price of doing what's right. The phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on Friday morning, jolting Frank from the deep sleep that had become increasingly elusive as he'd grown older. In the 3 years since Emma had come to live with him, early morning calls had meant only one thing: some kind of emergency that required immediate attention. Frank grabbed the phone from his nightstand, noting that Emma's door was still closed. She was a heavy sleeper, thank God, and wouldn't be awake for another hour. "Mitchell's Auto Repair," he said quietly, though his business greeting felt absurd at this hour. "Frank, it's Vicky." Victoria's voice was strained, barely controlled. "I'm sorry to call so early, but I didn't know who else. I need help." Frank was immediately alert, the fog of sleep burning away. "What's wrong?" "Everything," Victoria said, and Frank could hear that she was crying. "The board meeting yesterday? Harrison didn't just question my leadership. He accused me of financial impropriety, of using company resources for personal expenses. He's hired a private investigation firm, and he's threatening to go public with allegations unless I step down voluntarily." Frank sat up in bed, running a hand through his gray hair. "Are the allegations true?" "No, of course not." Victoria's voice rose, then immediately dropped, as she seemed to remember the early hour. "But that almost doesn't matter. Harrison has documentation that makes legitimate business expenses look suspicious. The car I bought to drive around anonymously, he's claiming I used petty cash to purchase a personal vehicle. The dinner meeting where board members told me I wasn't fit to lead. He's saying I charged an inappropriate personal meal to the company account." Frank was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. "So he's taking normal business activities and making them look improper." "Exactly, and the timing is perfect for him. The board is already questioning my judgment, and now he's providing them with evidence that I'm also ethically compromised." Victoria's voice cracked. "Frank, if this goes public, it won't just destroy my career. It'll destroy Sterling Industries. Customers won't want to do business with a company they think is corrupt. Employees will lose faith in leadership. The whole thing could collapse." Frank could hear traffic noise in the background of the call. "Where are you right now?" "Driving. I've been driving all night trying to think of a solution. I keep coming back to the same conclusion: Harrison wins. I have to choose between stepping down quietly and watching him destroy everything Richard and I built, or fighting the allegations and watching the scandal destroy the company anyway." The desperation in Victoria's voice reminded Frank of that rainy night 2 weeks ago when she'd been stranded and frightened. But this was worse. This wasn't a temporary crisis that could be solved with kindness and a cup of hot chocolate. This was someone's life's work being systematically dismantled by people who understood exactly how to exploit the system. "There has to be another option," Frank said. "I've been over it 1,000 times. Harrison has too much influence with the board, too much documentation that looks damaging, even if it's been taken out of context. The only thing that might change their minds would be some kind of proof that I'm not the unstable, irresponsible person he's painting me to be." Frank heard something in Victoria's voice that he couldn't quite identify. "What kind of proof?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. "Harrison's argument is that I'm emotionally compromised, that I make poor decisions because I'm still grieving Richard, and I don't have the kind of stable personal life that promotes good judgment. If I could demonstrate that I'm not isolated and unstable, that I have grounding in my personal life." Frank was beginning to understand where this was heading, and it made him uncomfortable. "Vicky, what are you thinking?" "I need to show the board that I'm not the grieving widow who can't move on. I need to demonstrate that I have emotional stability, that I'm building a new life while still honoring Richard's memory." Victoria's words came faster now, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as Frank. "If I were engaged to someone who clearly wasn't just interested in my money, someone with his own integrity and values—" "Buzz, stop," Frank said firmly. "Just stop right there. Frank, please, just listen. I know how this sounds, but It sounds like you're asking me to pretend to be your fiancé to fool your board of directors, Frank interrupted, which is exactly the kind of deception that your husband's uncle would love to expose. Victoria was crying openly now. I know it's not ideal. I know it goes against everything you believe about honesty and integrity. But Frank, I'm out of options. If I lose Sterling Industries, it's not just about me. There are 3,000 employees who depend on this company for their livelihoods. There are communities that rely on our manufacturing facilities. There are suppliers and contractors whose businesses would be devastated. Frank closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Victoria's desperation. And you think a fake engagement would solve this? I think it would buy me time. If the board sees that I'm moving forward with my life, that I have someone who believes in me and supports me, it undermines Harrison's narrative that I'm too emotionally damaged to lead effectively. Victoria's voice grew stronger as she spoke. It's not a permanent solution, but it might be enough to get through this immediate crisis. Frank heard Emma's alarm clock go off in the next room, the cheerful electronic beeping that signaled the start of another school day. In a few minutes, he'd need to get up and make breakfast, help Emma with any last-minute homework questions, and walk her to the bus stop. Normal grandfather duties in a normal life that was about to become very complicated if he said yes to Victoria's request. Vicky, I need you to think about what you're asking. You want me to lie to your board of directors, to pretend to be something I'm not, to help you deceive people who control a $500 million company. I want you to help me save the company my husband and I built together, Victoria replied quietly. I want you to help me protect 3,000 jobs and preserve the values that Sterling Industries was founded on. And yes, I'm asking you to do it by pretending to be engaged to me. Emma's door opened, and Frank could hear her moving around her room getting ready for school. In a few minutes, she'd emerged looking for breakfast and wanting to chat about her day ahead. How could he explain to a 10-year-old that he was considering entering into a fake engagement with one of the richest women in Colorado? Frank, Victoria's voice was small, vulnerable. I know I have no right to ask this of you. I know it goes against everything you stand for. But I also know that you understand what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. Frank thought about Tommy, about the decision his son had made to serve in the military despite having a young daughter at home. Tommy had chosen to risk everything for principles he believed in, for the idea that some things were worth fighting for even when the cost was enormous. If I said yes, Frank said slowly, what exactly would be involved? Victoria's relief was audible. Nothing elaborate, Usia. We'd need to make a few public appearances together, attend some social functions where board members would see us. I'd announce the engagement at the next board meeting, probably in about 2 weeks. We'd need to maintain the illusion for maybe 2 or 3 months, just long enough for me to stabilize my position and deal with Harrison's power play. And then we'd quietly break up. Amicably, I'd say that we realized we were rushing things, that we needed more time. No one gets hurt, no one looks bad. Frank rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache building. Vicky, do you have any idea how many ways this could go wrong? Probably a dozen that I haven't thought of, Victoria admitted. But Frank, I've run out of conventional options. Harrison has outmaneuvered me at every turn, and if I don't do something dramatic, I'm going to lose everything. Emma appeared in Frank's doorway, dressed for school and carrying her backpack. She gave him a curious look. Phone calls during breakfast prep were unusual, but didn't interrupt. I need time to think about this, Frank said into the phone. The board meets again on Monday, Victoria replied. If I'm going to announce an engagement, I need to do it then. Frank, I know this is an enormous favor to ask, and I know there are risks involved, but I also know that you're the only person I trust enough to ask. After Frank hung up, Emma sat down at the kitchen table while he automatically went through the motions of preparing breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast orange juice, the routine that anchored their mornings. That was Vicky, wasn't it? Emma asked. Frank looked at his granddaughter, wondering how much she'd overheard and how much she'd intuited from his side of the conversation. Yes, it was. She sounded upset. Frank set a plate of eggs in front of Emma and sat down across from her with his coffee. She's having problems at her company. People are trying to force her out of her job. Emma considered this while chewing a bite of toast. Are they doing it because she's a woman? The question surprised Frank, though he supposed it shouldn't have. Emma was perceptive and she'd been exposed to more adult conversations than most kids her age. Partly maybe, but mostly because they think they can make more money if they get rid of her. That's not fair. No, it's not. Emma finished her breakfast in thoughtful silence, then looked up at Frank with the direct gaze that meant she was about to ask a question he wouldn't want to answer. Is she going to ask you to help her? Frank stared at his granddaughter once again, amazed by her insight. What makes you think that? Because you're the kind of person people ask for help when they really need it, and because she trusts you. Emma tilted her head. Are you going to do it? Before Frank could answer, Emma continued, I think you should. Vicky's a good person, and good people should help each other. As Frank walked Emma to the bus stop 20 minutes later, her words echoed in his mind. Good people should help each other. It was the kind of simple moral clarity that children possessed and adults spent their lives trying to recapture. But it was also the kind of thinking that could lead a man to make decisions that would complicate his life in ways he couldn't anticipate. By the time Frank returned to the garage, Victoria was waiting for him, sitting in her Honda Civic in the parking area. She looked like she hadn't slept, and when she got out of the car, Frank could see that she'd been crying again. I'm sorry for ambushing you like this, she said, but I couldn't just wait by the phone. I need to know if you'll help me. Frank looked at Victoria, really looked at her. Beneath the expensive clothes and careful makeup, he saw someone who was fighting to preserve something she believed in, someone who was willing to risk everything rather than surrender to people who would destroy what she and her husband had built. He thought about Emma's words about Tommy's sacrifice, about his father's belief that a man had to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. I'll do it, Frank said quietly, but we do this my way with my rules. Victoria's relief was so profound that she actually swayed on her feet. Anything, whatever you think is best. First rule, no lies. We don't absolutely have to tell. We're engaged, fine, but if anyone asks direct questions about our relationship, we answer honestly about what we know and care about each other. Victoria nodded eagerly. Second rule, Emma comes first, always. If this arrangement puts her at risk or makes her uncomfortable in any way, it ends immediately. Of course. Third rule, when this is over, it's over. No drama, no hard feelings, no complicated aftermath. We go back to being friends who happen to help each other through a difficult time. Victoria's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Frank, I can't tell you what this means to me. Frank looked at her seriously. I hope you're right about this being the solution to your problems, because once we start down this road, there's no going back. Neither of them could have predicted that within hours, Harrison Sterling would accelerate his timeline, forcing them to begin their deception immediately under circumstances that would test not only Frank's commitment to helping Victoria, but his ability to protect Emma from the consequences of adult decisions that were spiraling beyond anyone's control. Frank had expected to have the weekend to prepare for whatever charade he'd agreed to participate in. He'd imagined careful planning sessions with Victoria, discussions about their fictional relationship history, maybe even some coaching on how to behave at the kind of social functions he'd never attended. Instead, Harrison Sterling forced their hand with ruthless efficiency. Victoria's phone rang at 2:30 that Friday afternoon while she and Frank were sitting in the garage office trying to work out the basic details of their arrangement. Emma was at her desk nearby, supposedly doing homework, but obviously listening to every word of the adult conversation with fascination. It's my assistant, Victoria said, glancing at the caller ID. I should take this. Frank listened to Victoria's side of the conversation, watching her expression grow increasingly tense. What do you mean immediately? Victoria said into the phone. I thought the deadline was Monday. No, I understand that Harrison called an emergency session, but yes, I'll be there within the hour. She hung up and turned to Frank with an expression of barely controlled panic. What happened? Frank asked, though he could guess it wasn't on good news. Harrison convinced 3 board members to call an emergency meeting for this afternoon. My assistant says he's claiming to have no evidence about my financial improprieties that can't wait for Monday's scheduled meeting. Victoria's hands were shaking as she put her phone back in her purse. If I don't show up, it looks like I'm avoiding scrutiny. If I do show up without some way to counter his narrative, you lose, Frank finished. I lose everything. Emma looked up from her homework with concern. Can't you just tell them that the mean uncle is lying? Victoria's laugh was bitter. Harrison's too smart for that, sweetheart. He's not technically lying. He's just presenting legitimate business expenses in the worst possible light. And he's doing it in front of people who are already predisposed to doubt my judgment. Frank studied Victoria's face, seeing the desperation that had driven her to propose their fake engagement in the first place. But he also saw something else, the same determined resolve that had impressed him during their work sessions on her car. Victoria Sterling might be cornered, but she wasn't defeated. "How much time do we have?" Frank asked. "The meeting's at 4 o'clock. It's a 20-minute drive to the Sterling Industries building." Victoria checked her watch. "So about 45 minutes to figure out how to save my company." Frank made a decision that would have terrified him if he'd taken time to think about it. "Then we don't wait. We do this now." Victoria stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we go to that meeting together. We walk in there as an engaged couple, and we let Harrison try to explain how a woman who's building a stable new relationship is somehow too emotionally compromised to run a company." Emma sat up straighter at her desk. "Grandpa Frank, are you going to marry Vicky?" Frank felt heat rise in his cheeks. In all their planning discussion, it hadn't occurred to him that Emma would need an explanation that was both honest and appropriate for a 10-year-old. "We're going to pretend to be engaged," Frank said carefully, "to help Vicky with her business problems. It's like acting in a play." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all adult matters. "But why do you have to pretend? Don't you like each other enough to really get in here?" The question hung in the air, and Frank realized that his granddaughter had identified the fundamental awkwardness of their situation. They were about to convince a room full of business executives that they were in love when they'd known each other for less than 3 weeks and had never even been on a date. Victoria spoke first. "Emma, your grandfather and I care about each other very much, but caring about someone and being ready to marry them are different things. We're pretending to be engaged because I need people to believe that I'm not forced and alone anymore. Does that make sense?" Emma nodded slowly. "Like when I pretend to be confident about the math competition, even though I'm nervous inside." "Exactly like that," Victoria said with obvious relief. Frank looked at his watch. "If we're going to do this, we need to address some practical issues. First, I can't show up to a corporate board meeting dressed like a mechanic." Victoria's eyes widened as she realized the scope of the transformation required. "You're right, but there's no time to go shopping." "Richard's clothes," Victoria said suddenly. "You're about the same size as my husband was. I kept everything. I couldn't bring myself to donate them." Her voice caught slightly. "If you're comfortable with that, we could stop by my house on the way to the office." Frank nodded, though the idea of wearing a dead man's clothes to help save his widow's company felt surreal. "What about Emma? I can't leave her here alone." "She comes with us," Victoria said immediately. "To my house, at least. Maybe Mrs." She paused, realizing she didn't know the name of Frank's neighbor. "Mrs. Patterson," Frank supplied. "She's watched Emma before in emergencies." 20 minutes later, Frank found himself standing in the master bedroom of Victoria's house, surrounded by a level of luxury that made him deeply uncomfortable. The house was a sprawling colonial in one of Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods, filled with the kind of furniture and artwork that cost more than Frank made in a year. But what struck him most was how empty it felt. Despite the expensive furnishings, there was something hollow about the space, as if it was maintained rather than lived in. "The closet's through here," Victoria said, leading him to a walk-in space larger than Emma's entire bedroom. Richard was about 6 feet tall, maybe 180, close to your build. Frank stood among racks of expensive suits, feeling like an imposter. "I wouldn't know how to pick appropriate clothes for a board meeting." "Navy suit, white shirt, conservative tie," Victoria said, automatically pulling items from the closet with practiced efficiency. Richard always said that classic choices were harder to criticize. As Frank changed clothes in the guest bathroom, he tried to process what he was about to do. In 30 minutes, he would walk into a corporate boardroom and pretend to be engaged to one of Colorado's most powerful businesswomen. He would need to convince skeptical executives that his relationship with Victoria was genuine, that he wasn't some gold digger who had targeted a grieving widow, and that his presence in her life represented stability rather than opportunism. The man who looked back at him from the guest bathroom mirror was almost unrecognizable. Richard Sterling's navy suit fit surprisingly well, and the transformation from working-class mechanic to whatever he was supposed to be now was startling. Victoria was waiting in the foyer when Frank emerged, and her expression when she saw him was impossible to interpret. Surprise, certainly, but something else, perhaps approval, or maybe just the shock of seeing someone else wearing her husband's clothes. "You look," Victoria started, then stopped. "You look perfect." "I feel like a fraud," Frank admitted. "Welcome to the corporate world," Victoria replied with a bitter smile. "Half of business is pretending to be something you're not." During the drive to Sterling Industries, Victoria briefed Frank on what to expect. The emergency board meeting would include 7 voting members plus Harrison Sterling as an observer. Victoria would be asked to respond to Harrison's allegations, and then the board would discuss her leadership in executive session. "The key is to present a united front," Victoria said as they pulled into the executive parking garage. "We need to appear comfortable together like a couple who've been through challenges but have found strength in each other." Frank nodded, though privately he wondered how convincing they could be when they'd never even held hands. The Sterling Industries building was everything Frank had expected from a $500 million company: marble lobbies, expensive art, the kind of understated luxury that spoke of serious money. As they rode the elevator to the executive floor, Frank noticed that Victoria's breathing had become more rapid. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Victoria admitted, "but also grateful. Frank, whatever happens in there, I want you to know that having you beside me makes this bearable." The elevator opened onto a hallway lined with conference rooms, and Victoria led Frank toward the largest one. Through the glass walls, he could see several people in expensive suits seated around a polished table. At the head of the table sat a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Harrison," Victoria said under her breath as they approached the conference room. Frank got his first look at Victoria's adversary and immediately understood why she'd been struggling. Harrison Sterling carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his right to control other people's lives. His smile as he watched them approach was predatory, like a cat who had cornered a mouse and was savoring the moment before the kill. "Victoria," Harrison said as they entered the room, his voice carrying false warmth. "How good of you to join us on such short notice. And you've brought a guest." The 7 board members turned to study Frank with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disapproval. Frank recognized the look. It was the same assessment he'd received countless times when he'd been called to fix cars in wealthy neighborhoods, the subtle evaluation that asked whether he belonged in their world. "I'd like you all to meet Frank Mitchell," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the tension Frank could feel radiating from her. We're engaged." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank could see Harrison's expression shift from predatory satisfaction to calculation as he processed this unexpected development. "Engaged," said a woman in her 50s, whom Frank assumed was one of the board members. "Victoria, this is quite sudden, isn't it?" Victoria reached for Frank's hand and he felt the slight tremor in her fingers as they interlaced. "We've been seeing each other for several weeks. Frank has been a source of strength during this difficult time." "I see," Harrison said, and Frank could practically hear the wheels turning in the older man's mind. "And what line of work are you in, Mr. Mitchell?" Frank felt 7 pairs of expensive eyes focused on him, waiting for an answer that would either validate or destroy Victoria's credibility. He thought about Emma's advice: good people should help each other, and about his father's teaching that integrity meant being honest about who you were. "I'm an auto mechanic," Frank said simply. "I own a small garage on the east side of town." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Several board members exchanged glances that suggested Frank had confirmed their worst suspicions about Victoria's judgment. Harrison's smile widened slightly as if Christmas had come early. "How interesting," Harrison said. "And how did you two meet?" Victoria squeezed Frank's hand, and he could feel her tension spike. This was the moment where their story could fall apart, where the wrong answer could expose their entire deception. Frank made a choice to stick with the truth as much as possible. "Victoria's car broke down near my garage," he said. "It was raining and she needed help. I fixed her car and we started talking. One thing led to another." "How romantic," Harrison said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but. "A chance meeting during a breakdown. Almost like a fairy tale." Frank felt his temper beginning to rise at Harrison's mocking tone, but before he could respond, Victoria spoke up. Frank saw me at my worst moment and treated me with kindness and respect, she said, her voice gaining strength. He didn't know who I was or what I could do for him. He helped me because it was the right thing to do. In my experience, that kind of character is rare in any line of work. One of the board members, a man in his 70s, who looked like he'd spent his career in boardrooms, leaned forward. Mr. Mitchell, you understand that Victoria runs a company worth $500 million. That's a considerable responsibility requiring complete focus and sound judgment. What are your thoughts on that? Frank felt the weight of the question, understanding that his answer could determine Victoria's future. He thought about their conversations during the car repair sessions, about her passion for the company's values, about her genuine concern for employees and communities. I think Victoria is one of the most capable people I've ever met, Frank said honestly. She learned automotive repair in 2 weeks because she wanted to understand how things work at a fundamental level. She cares about the people who work for this company, not just as employees, but as human beings. And she's fighting to preserve values that her husband believed in, even when it would be easier to give up. Frank paused, looking around the table at faces that showed varying degrees of skepticism and interest. I may not understand corporate finance or board governance, he continued, but I understand character. And Victoria has more integrity than anyone I've ever known. If you're looking for someone who will make decisions based on what's right rather than what's easy, you're not going to find anyone better. The room was quiet for a moment, and Frank could see that his words had at least given some board members pause. But Harrison wasn't finished. That's very touching, Mr. Mitchell, Harrison said. But I have to ask, isn't this relationship rather convenient? Victoria's facing questions about her leadership, and suddenly she's engaged to someone who can provide the appearance of stability. Frank felt Victoria's hand tighten in his, and he realized they'd reached the moment of maximum danger. Harrison had identified exactly what they were doing, and now he was going to expose them unless Frank could somehow deflect the attack. You know what I find convenient, Frank said, his voice hardening? The timing of your concerns about Victoria's leadership. She's been running this company successfully for 2 years, but suddenly you're questioning her competence right when she's building a new life for herself. That seems like the kind of convenience that serves someone's agenda. Harrison's eyes flashed with anger. Mr. Mitchell, you don't understand the complexities. I understand that Victoria told me about your plans to cut employee benefits and move manufacturing overseas, Frank interrupted. I understand that you think maximizing profit is more important than maintaining the values this company was built on. And I understand that you're using her personal life as a weapon to get control of decisions you couldn't influence any other way. The boardroom had gone completely silent. Frank realized he'd probably just destroyed any chance of their plan succeeding, but he found he didn't care. Harrison Sterling represented everything Frank despised about the corporate world: the willingness to destroy people's lives for profit, the belief that money justified any behavior. Frank, Victoria said quietly, but her voice carried a note of pride rather than concern. Harrison's composure had cracked slightly. I think it's clear that Victoria's judgment has been compromised by her personal relationships. This man knows nothing about business, yet he's making accusations about board decisions that he couldn't possibly understand. He understands honesty, said the elderly board member who had questioned Frank earlier, which is more than I can say for some of the maneuvering I've witnessed lately. Another board member, a woman Frank hadn't heard speak before, addressed Victoria directly. How long have you been engaged? Victoria hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Frank to realize she was about to lie about something that could be easily verified. We haven't set a date yet, Frank said quickly. We're taking things slowly, making sure we're both ready for that kind of commitment. It was the truth in a way, and it had the advantage of being impossible to contradict. The same board member turned to Frank. And you're comfortable with the level of scrutiny that comes with being married to someone in Victoria's position. Frank thought about Emma, about the quiet life they'd built together, about how different their world would become if he actually married into Victoria's sphere of wealth and influence. I'm comfortable with supporting someone I care about, Frank said simply. The rest we'll figure out as we go. Harrison made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. The board needs to consider whether personal relationships, particularly new ones, are affecting Victoria's business judgment. The timing of this engagement combined with recent questionable expenses. The questionable expenses you're referring to, Victoria interrupted, include the legitimate business meal where you and other board members told me I wasn't fit to lead this company, and the used car I purchased to have a vehicle that wouldn't attract attention when I needed to think through business problems away from the office. If maintaining my mental health and safety constitutes financial impropriety, then this board has bigger problems than my leadership. Frank watched the dynamics around the table and realized that something had shifted. Several board members were now looking at Harrison with skepticism rather than at Victoria. The attack that was supposed to destroy her credibility had revealed the attacker's true motives. The elderly board member who seemed to carry the most influence spoke into the silence. I think we need to adjourn this meeting and reconvene on Monday as originally scheduled. This gives everyone time to consider what we've heard today. As the board members filed out, Harrison lingered studying Frank with undisguised hostility. "This isn't over," Harrison said quietly. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Frank met Harrison's gaze steadily. "Neither do you." After Harrison left, Victoria sank into one of the conference room chairs, the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation finally ebbing. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that," she said. "I can't believe I agreed to this whole thing," Frank replied, loosening the tie that felt like it was strangling him. "Did we just make things better or worse?" Victoria looked up at him with something that might have been admiration. "I don't know, but for the first time in months, I feel like I'm not fighting alone." Frank sat down beside her, still trying to process what had just happened. In the space of an hour, he'd entered a world he didn't understand, made enemies he couldn't afford, and committed himself to a deception that was already more complicated than either of them had anticipated. "Victoria," he said quietly, "I need you to know that everything I said in there about your character and capabilities, that was all true. I wasn't acting when I said that." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I know. That's what made it so powerful." As they prepared to leave, Frank realized that their fake engagement, Owen, had already begun to change into something he couldn't quite define. They weren't in love, but they weren't exactly pretending anymore either. They were two people who had chosen to trust each other in a situation where trust was a luxury neither of them could afford. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Frank began to wonder if the line between pretending to care about someone and actually caring about them was thinner than he'd thought. The weekend that followed the emergency board meeting passed in a blur of preparation and growing anxiety. Frank had expected their public debut as an engaged couple to involve careful planning and gradual exposure to Victoria's social circle. Instead, Harrison Sterling's aggressive tactics had forced them into an accelerated timeline that left little room for error. "3 events this week," Victoria said on Monday morning, consulting the schedule her assistant had prepared. She was sitting at the small table in Frank's apartment above the garage, looking incongruous in her tailored business suit, surrounded by Frank's simple furnishings. "The Chamber of Commerce dinner tomorrow night, the charity auction Thursday evening, and the country club fundraiser on Saturday." Emma looked up from her cereal with interest. "Are you going to wear fancy dresses to all of them?" "I suppose I am," Victoria replied, though she seemed more concerned about Frank's preparation than her own wardrobe. "Frank, I've arranged for someone to help you with appropriate clothes. Richard's suits fit well enough for the boardroom, but these social events have different requirements." Frank felt his stomach clench at the thought of spending his evenings surrounded by the kind of people who attended charity auctions at country clubs. "Victoria, I need to be clear about something. I can pretend to be your fiancé, but I can't pretend to be someone I'm not. If these people expect me to know about wine or art or whatever wealthy people talk about at dinner parties, they'll expect you to be exactly who you are," Victoria interrupted gently. "Frank, the story we're telling is that I fell in love with someone genuine, someone who grounds me in reality. If you try to act like you belong in that world, it defeats the whole purpose." Emma finished her cereal and gathered her school supplies. "Grandpa Frank, you're going to be great. You always know what to say when people are upset or scared." As Frank walked Emma to the bus stop, her confidence in him provided a small measure of comfort, but it also reminded him of the stakes involved. If their deception was exposed, if Harrison Sterling succeeded in destroying Victoria's credibility by revealing their fake engagement, the fallout could extend beyond just Victoria's business problems. Frank's reputation in his own community could be damaged, and Emma could become the subject of gossip and speculation at school. The first test came sooner than expected. Frank was working on a brake job Tuesday afternoon when a black sedan pulled up outside the garage. The man who emerged wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement, or at least someone who wanted to be mistaken for law enforcement. "Frank Mitchell," the man asked, flashing a credentials wallet too quickly for Frank to read the details. "That's me. What can I do for you?" "I'm conducting a background investigation for Sterling Industries." "I understand you're engaged to Victoria Sterling." Frank straightened up, wiping his hands on his shop rag. "That's right." "When did the relationship begin?" The question was phrased casually, but Frank recognized it as the opening move in what was probably a comprehensive effort to discredit him. Harrison Sterling wasn't waiting for the board's decision, he was building a case. "A few weeks ago," Frank replied truthfully. "Can you be more specific?" Frank looked at the man's expensive watch, his manicured fingernails, his shoes that had never seen a day of honest work. This wasn't a legitimate corporate security investigation. This was harassment designed to make Frank uncomfortable enough to back away from Victoria. "I can be as specific as you want," Frank said pleasantly. "But first, let me see those credentials again." Slowly this time. The man hesitated, and Frank knew he'd guessed correctly. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm simply trying to verify." "You're trying to intimidate me," Frank interrupted, "and you're trespassing on private property. So either show me legitimate identification that gives you authority to ask these questions, or get off my lot." The man's professional facade slipped slightly. "This is a serious matter, Mr. Mitchell. Mrs. Sterling's personal relationships are subject to scrutiny, given her position. By the board of directors, maybe, not by private investigators working for someone who's trying to stage a corporate coup." Frank stepped closer to the man, using his full height to maximum advantage. "You can tell Harrison Sterling that if he wants to question my relationship with Victoria, he can do it at the next board meeting. In the meantime, stay away from my business and stay away from my granddaughter." After the investigator left, Frank called Victoria to report the encounter. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. "He sent a private investigator to your garage without telling the board." Victoria's voice carried a level of anger Frank hadn't heard before. "That's completely inappropriate. It's also potentially illegal if the man was impersonating a law enforcement officer." "What does this mean for us?" Frank asked. "It means Harrison is getting desperate, which makes him more dangerous." Victoria paused. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is there anything in your past that Harrison could use against you? Any financial problems, legal issues, anything that could be twisted to make you look like you're targeting me for money?" Frank thought about his modest savings account, his clean criminal record, his history of paying taxes and maintaining his business license. "Nothing significant. I was audited by the IRS 8 years ago and came out clean. I've never been arrested for anything more serious than a speeding ticket. My credit's good, my business is legitimate." "What about debts, medical bills from when Emma came to live with you?" "Some, but nothing unusual for a working-class family. Emma's covered by my health insurance, and I've been putting money aside for her college fund." Frank hesitated. "Victoria, is my background going to be a problem?" "Your background is perfect," Victoria replied firmly. "Harrison can investigate all he wants. What he's going to find is exactly what I found: a good man who works hard, takes care of his family, and treats people with respect. That's not something he can discredit." But Harrison Sterling's next move proved that he understood exactly how to weaponize Frank's most admirable qualities. The call came Wednesday evening while Frank was helping Emma with her math homework. Victoria's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Harrison's filed a motion with the board claiming that you're exploiting my emotional vulnerability for financial gain," she said without preamble. "He's arguing that a working-class man with limited financial resources has obvious motivation to pursue a relationship with a wealthy widow." Frank felt Emma's eyes on him as he processed this information. "What kind of motion?" "He wants the board to require full financial disclosure from both of us, including details about any gifts, loans, or financial arrangements between us. He's also requesting a psychological evaluation to determine whether I'm competent to make personal decisions that could affect the company." Emma looked up from her homework. Is something wrong? Frank held up a finger, signaling that he needed a moment to finish the conversation. Victoria, what does this mean practically? It means we're going to the Chamber of Commerce dinner tomorrow night, whether we're ready or not. Harrison's going to be there along with several board members, and this may be our only chance to present ourselves as a genuine couple before the board votes. After Frank hung up, Emma closed her math book and gave him her full attention. Grandpa Frank, are you and Vicky in trouble? Frank sat down beside his granddaughter, trying to figure out how to explain corporate politics to a 10-year-old. Vicky's company is like a really big version of our garage, he said. There are people who help make decisions about how it should be run, kind of like if I had partners who help me decide what services to offer or what prices to charge. Emma nodded seriously. One of those people wants to take control of the company away from Vicky. He's trying to convince the other decision makers that she's not doing a good job. But she is doing a good, right? I think so, but this man is very good at making people doubt things that are true. Emma considered this. And you're helping her by pretending to be her boyfriend? Frank felt his cheeks warm slightly. We're engaged, which is different from being boyfriend and girlfriend, but yes, essentially. Do you like her enough that you might want to really marry her someday? The question hit Frank like a physical blow. In all their planning and preparation, he'd been so focused on the immediate deception that he hadn't seriously considered the emotional implications of what they were doing. I don't know, kiddo, Frank said honestly. Vicky is a wonderful person, but she lives in a very different world from us. Sometimes caring about someone isn't enough to make a relationship work. Emma seemed to accept this answer, but her next question revealed that she'd been thinking about their situation more seriously than Frank had realized. If you did marry her, would we have to move away from here? Frank looked around their small apartment, the kitchen where he'd taught Emma to make scrambled eggs, the living room where they watched movies together on Friday nights, the home they'd built together after Tommy's death. I don't know, he admitted. But Emma, I want you to understand something. No matter what happens with Vicky, no matter where we live or how our life changes, you're the most important thing in my world. I would never make a decision that wasn't in your best interest. Emma smiled and hugged him. I know, Grandpa Frank. I trust you. As Frank lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of their neighborhood, he realized that Emma's questions had forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding. His feelings for Victoria were becoming more complicated than he'd anticipated. He respected her intelligence and determination. He admired her commitment to her employees and her willingness to fight for her principles. He enjoyed her company and found himself looking forward to their conversations. But more troubling was the growing realization that their fake engagement was beginning to feel less fake with each passing day. When Victoria smiled at him when she reached for his hand, during tense moments when she talked about their future together in front of other people, some part of Frank was starting to wish the pretense was real. Which meant that when their arrangement ended, as it inevitably would, he wouldn't just be losing a friend who had brought excitement and purpose back into his life. He'd be losing the possibility of something he was only now beginning to understand he wanted. The Chamber of Commerce dinner the following evening took place in the ballroom of Denver's most exclusive hotel. Frank, wearing another of Richard Sterling's suits, felt like an actor who had wandered onto the wrong movie set. The room was filled with the kind of people he'd only seen in magazines, politicians, business leaders, social figures, who moved through the space with the easy confidence of those accustomed to being the most important people in any room. Remember, Victoria murmured as they entered the reception area. We've been together for a month. We're taking things slowly, but we're serious about each other. And Frank, yeah, just be yourself. That's who I fell in love with. The word love hit Frank harder than Victoria had probably intended. She was playing her role, speaking the language their audience expected to hear. But something in her voice suggested that the line between performance and reality was blurring for her too. The evening's first challenge came within minutes of their arrival when Harrison Sterling approached them with two other men Frank didn't recognize. Victoria, how lovely to see you, Harrison said with false warmth. And Frank, isn't it, I'd like you to meet Judge Robert Carlyle and District Attorney Michael Chen. Gentlemen, this is Victoria's fiancé. Frank recognized the setup immediately. Harrison had brought law enforcement officials to meet the mechanic who was supposedly taking advantage of a grieving widow. The implication was clear: if Frank was running some kind of con game, these were the men who could expose and prosecute him. Judge Carlisle, Frank said, extending his hand with genuine respect. District Attorney Chen, I'm honored to meet you both. Judge Carlisle, a man in his 70s with the bearing of someone who had spent decades making important decisions, studied Frank with sharp eyes. I understand you're in automotive repair, Mr. Mitchell. Yes, sir. I own a small garage on the east side of town. Been in business for about 15 years. And how did you and Victoria meet? District Attorney Cheney asked. Frank gave the same honest account he provided to the board, but he could see Harrison listening carefully for any inconsistencies that could be exploited later. Quite a coincidence, Judge Carlisle observed, a chance meeting that led to engagement so quickly. Victoria stepped closer to Frank, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that looked natural but felt electric. When you meet the right person, you know it, she said simply. Frank saw me at my worst moment and treated me with kindness. That told me everything I needed to know about his character. District Attorney Chen nodded approvingly. Character matters more than circumstances. My wife and I met when she was working as a waitress and I was a struggling prosecutor. Sometimes the best relationships come from unexpected places. Frank could see Harrison's disappointment that his attempted ambush had failed to produce the desired result. But the evening was far from over, and Frank knew there would be other tests. The dinner itself was an education in social dynamics Frank had never experienced. He was seated between Victoria and the wife of a city council member, surrounded by conversations about municipal bonds, charity fundraising, and political maneuvering that went completely over his head. But as the evening progressed, Frank began to realize that his outsider status was actually an advantage. People seemed to appreciate his straightforward questions and honest observations. When the conversation turned to infrastructure spending, Frank could speak knowledgeably about the condition of city streets and their impact on small businesses. When someone mentioned workforce development, Frank talked about the challenge of finding skilled employees and the value of vocational training. You have an interesting perspective, Frank, said the city council member's wife. Most people in Victoria's position surround themselves with other business executives. It's refreshing to hear from someone who understands working-class concerns. Victoria squeezed his hand under the table. Frank keeps me grounded, she said. He reminds me that business decisions affect real people with real lives. As the evening wound down, Frank felt like they'd successfully navigated their first public test. But Harrison Sterling had one more card to play. During the final networking period, Harrison approached them with a photographer from one of Denver's society magazines. Victoria, I thought you'd want to announce your engagement properly, Harrison said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah here would love to get a few photos for next month's issue. Frank realized instantly that this was a trap. Once their engagement appeared in print, it would be much harder to end quietly when their arrangement had served its purpose. They'd be locked into a public narrative that would require a public resolution. But before Frank could object, Victoria stepped forward with a smile that matched Harrison's for false warmth. How thoughtful of you, Harrison. Frank and I would be delighted. As the photographer positioned them for the shot, Victoria leaned close to Frank's ear. Trust me, she whispered. Frank hoped she knew what she was doing because they'd just crossed a line that would make their eventual separation infinitely more complicated. But as the camera flashed and he felt Victoria's hand in his, Frank realized that part of him didn't mind being locked into this narrative. Part of him was beginning to hope that it wouldn't have to end at all. The photograph appeared in Denver Society magazine 3 days later, accompanied by an article that described Frank as a refreshing change from the usual corporate executives typically found in Colorado's social elite. The piece quoted Victoria extensively about finding love again after loss and included enough personal details about their relationship to make Frank wince. But the real impact came from an unexpected source. Frank was replacing a transmission on Tuesday morning when Mrs. Patterson knocked on the garage door holding a copy of the magazine with obvious excitement. "Frank Mitchell, you dark horse," she exclaimed. "My bridge club is absolutely beside themselves. We always knew you were a catch, but Victoria Sterling, she's lovely, by the way." The magazine makes her sound very down to earth. Word spread through the neighborhood with remarkable speed. By afternoon, Frank had received visits from the Methodist minister congratulating him on finding happiness again, the postal worker asking if this meant he'd be moving to a fancy neighborhood, and 3 regular customers who wanted to know if he'd still be running the garage after he married that rich lady. The attention made Frank deeply uncomfortable, but it also served an important purpose. If Harrison Sterling's investigators wanted to verify the legitimacy of Frank and Victoria's relationship, they'd find a neighborhood full of people who were genuinely happy for Frank and believed completely in the engagement. Emma's reaction to the magazine article was more complex. "You look really happy in the picture," she observed, studying the photograph that showed Frank and Victoria smiling at each other with what appeared to be genuine affection. "Do I?" Frank asked, looking at the image over her shoulder. "Yeah, like when you used to look at Grandma Sarah before she got sick." The comparison hit Frank harder than Emma probably intended. His relationship with Sarah had been built over 30 years of marriage, through the birth and raising of their son, through challenges and celebrations that had bonded them in ways Frank had never thought he'd experience again. What he felt for Victoria was different, newer, more tentative, complicated by the circumstances that had brought them together. But Emma's observation forced him to acknowledge that his feelings had evolved far beyond the simple friendship he'd thought he was pretending to feel. The recognition came at an unfortunate time because Victoria's situation at Sterling Industries was reaching its climax. "The final board vote is scheduled for Friday," Victoria told Frank over dinner Thursday evening. They were eating at the small table in his apartment, a deliberate choice to maintain some privacy away from the public scrutiny their engagement had attracted. Emma was at Mrs. Patterson's house for the evening, giving Frank and Victoria a chance to discuss strategy without needing to filter their conversation for young ears. "How are the votes looking?" Frank asked. "Closer than I'd like. Harrison's been working hard to convince board members that our engagement is a desperate attempt to appear stable. He's also raising questions about whether my judgment has been compromised by emotional involvement." Frank set down his fork, studying Victoria's face. The stress of the past few weeks had taken a visible toll, shadows under her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there when they'd first met. "Victoria, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She looked up with wariness. "Okay. Yeah, do you think we're fooling anyone? I mean, really fooling them? Because I'm starting to wonder if we're just playing out an elaborate charade that everyone can see through." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, absently turning her engagement ring, a simple solitaire they'd chosen together for its understated elegance, around her finger. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I think some people believe it's real. Others are probably suspicious, but willing to give us the benefit of the doubt. And some, like Harrison, are convinced it's fake, but can't prove it." "What about you?" Frank asked quietly. "Do you think it's fake?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had been willing to address directly. Victoria met his eyes. "I think it started as fake, but I also think that somewhere along the way, we stopped acting and started something else." Frank felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of something else?" "I don't know. That's what scares me." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "Frank, when this is over, when I've secured my position at the company and we can end our arrangement, what happens to us?" It was the question Frank had been avoiding for weeks. The conversation they'd both known was inevitable, but had postponed as long as possible. "I don't know," Frank said honestly. "I care about you, Victoria, more than I expected to, more than I probably should given how this started. But we live in different worlds. When you're not fighting for your company's survival, when you don't need a mechanic to prove your stability to skeptical board members, would you still want to be with someone like me?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Someone like you, Frank. Do you have any idea how rare you are? Do you know how many people I've met in the corporate world who would sell their integrity for a stock option? You've risked your reputation, your privacy, your comfortable life to help someone you barely knew, and you've done it without asking for anything in return." "That's not true," Frank said. "I've gotten something out of this arrangement. I've gotten to spend time with someone remarkable, someone who's reminded me that there's more to life than just getting by day to day." They stared at each other across the small table, the weight of unspoken possibilities filling the space between them. "So what do we do?" Victoria asked finally. Before Frank could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma's name, which was unusual since she was supposed to be at Mrs. Patterson's house. "Emma," Frank answered with concern, Grandpa Frank, there are men outside Mrs. Patterson's house taking pictures. She says I should call you. Frank's blood ran cold. What kind of men? They have big cameras and they keep trying to look through the windows. Mrs. Patterson called the police, but they said the men are on the sidewalk, so they're not doing anything illegal. Victoria was already reaching for her purse. Paparazzi, she said grimly. Harrison must have tipped them off about where Emma stays. Frank was already moving toward the door. We'll be right there, kiddo. Stay inside with Mrs. Patterson until we get there. The drive to Mrs. Patterson's house took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Frank could see the photographers before they turned onto the street, 3 men with professional cameras, and the aggressive posture of people who made their living invading other people's privacy. Let me handle this, Victoria said as Frank parked the truck. No, this is my granddaughter, my neighborhood. I handle it. Frank got out of the truck and walked directly toward the photographers who immediately began snapping pictures. Mr. Mitchell, is it true you're marrying Victoria Sterling for her money? How does it feel to go from fixing cars to living in a mansion? What's your response to allegations that this engagement is fake? Frank ignored the questions and walked up to the nearest photographer. You have 10 seconds to pack up your equipment and leave this neighborhood, he said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had never made an idle threat. We're on a public sidewalk, the photographer replied. We have every right to be here. You have the right to be here, Frank agreed. You also have the right to keep all your teeth, but not if you are still here in 9 seconds. The photographer looked at Frank, really looked at him, taking in the 6-foot frame, the calloused hands, the expression that suggested he'd grown up settling problems with something other than lawyers and apparently decided that dental work was expensive. Come on, he told his colleagues. We got enough shots. After the photographers left, Frank collected Emma from Mrs. Patterson's house where the elderly woman was still indignant about the invasion of their quiet street. I've lived here for 40 years, Ms. Patterson declared, and I've never seen such behavior. Taking pictures of a child through windows, it's unconscionable. During the drive home, Emma was unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke up from the back seat. Grandpa Frank, are you really going to marry Vicky for her money? Frank felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Is that what you think? No, but that's what those men said, and kids at school have been asking me about it. Victoria turned in her seat to face Emma. Sweetheart, your grandfather isn't marrying me for money. He's helping me because I asked him to because I was in trouble, and he's the kind of person who helps people in trouble. But you're not really engaged, right? It's still pretend. Frank met Victoria's eyes, seeing his own confusion reflected there. How could they explain to a 10-year-old that they weren't sure anymore whether their engagement was real or fake? It's complicated, kiddo, Frank said finally. We started out pretending, but sometimes when people pretend to care about each other, they discover that maybe they really do care about each other. Emma seemed to consider this. So you might really get married? We might, Victoria said quietly, if we can figure out how to make it work. That night after Emma had gone to bed, Frank and Victoria sat on the small couch in his living room, both lost in thought about the day's events and the conversation that lay ahead. The board votes tomorrow, Victoria said finally. Yeah. Whatever happens, Frank, I want you to know that this has been the most real thing in my life for the past 2 years. Frank looked at her, really looked at her. Without the corporate armor, without the designer clothes and professional makeup, sitting in his modest living room, wearing jeans and one of his old sweatshirts, she was just Victoria. Not Victoria Sterling CEO, but the woman who had learned to change her own oil, who genuinely cared about Emma's math homework, who had brought laughter and warmth back into his daily routine. Victoria, he said slowly, when this started, you said we'd quietly break up when it was over, amicably with no drama. Victoria nodded, though Frank could see the pain in her eyes. I don't want to break up, Frank continued. I want to find out if this thing between us can work for real, without the pretense, without the corporate politics, without any agenda, except seeing if we can build something genuine together. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Frank, are you sure? Because once we cross that line, once we admit this is real, there's no going back to being just friends who helped each other through a crisis. Frank reached for her hand, remembering the first time he'd held it in that corporate boardroom when it had been just part of their performance. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'm sure," he said. "The question is whether you want the same thing." Victoria smiled through her tears. "I've never wanted anything more." The board meeting the next morning took place in the same conference room where Frank and Victoria had first announced their engagement. But this time the dynamic was completely different. Harrison Sterling had prepared for a final assault on Victoria's credibility, armed with private investigator reports and innuendo about her relationship with Frank. What he hadn't prepared for was walking into a room where Victoria looked genuinely happy for the first time in 2 years. "Before we begin," Victoria said as the meeting was called to order, "I want to address the concerns that have been raised about my personal relationships and their impact on my judgment." She looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over the past month of corporate warfare. "You've questioned whether my engagement to Frank Mitchell represents stability or instability, whether it demonstrates good judgment or poor judgment. I'd like you to consider this. Frank has asked for nothing from me except the chance to be part of my life. He's refused gifts, turned down offers of financial assistance, and maintained his own business and independence throughout our relationship. If I wanted to find someone interested only in my money, I could hardly have made a worse choice." Victoria paused, allowing her words to sink in. "Frank has taught me something important about leadership. He's shown me that the best decisions aren't always the ones that produce the highest quarterly profits. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones that demonstrate your values, that show what you stand for when it would be easier to compromise." The elderly board member who had been Frank's unlikely ally during their first confrontation leaned forward. "Are you saying that your relationship has influenced your business philosophy?" "I'm saying that my relationship has reminded me why Richard and I built this company in the first place. Not to maximize shareholder value at any cost, but to create something that would make a positive difference in the world. Frank understands that in a way that no MBA program could teach." Harrison made one final attempt to derail Victoria's momentum. "This is exactly what I've been warning you about. Victoria's judgment has been compromised by personal emotions. She's making business decisions based on romantic notions rather than financial reality." The room was silent for a moment. Then the elderly board member spoke. "Harrison, I've been watching Victoria lead this company for 2 years. I've seen her navigate economic challenges, labor disputes, and competitive pressures with skill and integrity. The only time I've questioned her judgment was when she seemed to be losing confidence in herself. If this relationship has restored that confidence, if it's reminded her of the values that made Sterling Industries successful in the first place, then I'd say it's exactly what this company needed." The vote, when it came, wasn't even close. Victoria retained her position as CEO by a margin of 6-1, with only Harrison Sterling's representative voting against her. As the board members filed out offering congratulations and expressing relief that the crisis had passed, Victoria and Frank found themselves alone in the conference room where their fake engagement had begun. "So," Victoria said, "I guess I'm still CEO. How does it feel? Like I can finally breathe again?" Victoria moved closer to Frank, reaching for his hands. "And Frank, that speech I gave about values and making a positive difference, that wasn't just corporate rhetoric. You really have changed how I think about leadership." Frank pulled her closer, marveling at how right it felt to hold her without pretense, without agenda, without anything except the simple desire to be close to someone he cared about. "Does this mean our engagement is real now?" he asked. Victoria smiled, the first genuinely carefree expression he'd seen from her since they'd met. "I think it's been real for a while. We just stopped pretending it wasn't." As they kissed in the conference room that had witnessed their first tentative steps toward each other, Frank realized that Emma had been right all along. Good people should help each other. Sometimes that help came in the form of fixing someone's car on a rainy night. Sometimes it came in the form of pretending to be engaged to save someone's company. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it came in the form of discovering that the person you were pretending to love was someone you could love for real. 18 months later, Frank stood in the backyard of the house he now shared with Victoria and Emma, watching his granddaughter demonstrate the proper technique for changing a tire to a group of her classmates. The spring afternoon was perfect for the automotive basics class that had become a monthly tradition Victoria's idea implemented, with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered the satisfaction of understanding how things actually worked. "Remember, Emma was saying to her fascinated audience. You always loosen the lug nuts before you jack up the car. If you try to do it while the wheel is off the ground, you'll just spin the tire instead of turning the nuts. Frank smiled, recognizing his own words repeated with the confidence of someone who had absorbed the lesson completely. At 11, Emma had become something of a celebrity at her school, not because of her family's newfound wealth, but because she was the only sixth grader who could diagnose engine problems and explain the difference between front-wheel and all-wheel drive. She's a natural teacher, Victoria said, joining Frank on the patio with 2 glasses of iced tea, just like her grandfather. Frank accepted the tea gratefully, still marveling at how seamlessly Victoria had adapted to their life together. The woman who had once lived in corporate boardrooms now spent her Saturday afternoons teaching neighborhood kids about automotive repair, and she seemed genuinely happier for the change. How did the board meeting go this morning? Frank asked. Victoria's face lit up with the kind of excitement that had become familiar whenever she talked about the company's new direction. They approved the expansion of the vocational training program. We're going to partner with 3 more community colleges to provide automotive technology education. By next year, we'll be training 200 new mechanics annually. The program had been Victoria's initiative, inspired by her recognition that skilled trades were both essential to the economy and undervalued by traditional education systems. Sterling Industries now provided equipment instructors and guaranteed job placement for graduates, an investment in community development that had initially worried profit-focused board members, but had proven remarkably successful, both financially and socially. Harrison's probably spinning in his grave, Frank observed. Harrison's not dead, Victoria replied with amusement. He's running a private equity firm in New York, making money by dismantling companies and selling the pieces, which is probably where he belonged all along. The aftermath of Harrison Sterling's failed coup had been swift and decisive. Faced with clear evidence that his attempts to undermine Victoria had damaged company morale and public reputation, the board had asked for his resignation. He'd left Colorado within a month, leaving behind only some bitter newspaper interviews about the amateur hour leadership that was supposedly destroying Sterling Industries. Instead, the company had posted record profits for 2 consecutive years, while simultaneously expanding employee benefits and community investment. Victoria's approach to leadership, balancing financial success with social responsibility, had proven that the choice between profitability and principles was often a false one. "Dad's here," Emma called from across the yard, and Frank looked up to see a familiar figure emerging from the house. Frank still did double takes sometimes when people referred to him as Emma's father rather than her grandfather. The adoption had been finalized 6 months after his marriage to Victoria, a legal recognition of what had been emotionally true for years. At 31, Frank had become a father for the first time just as he was approaching 60, and the experience was simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating. "The tire-changing demonstration is a complete success," Victoria reported as Frank approached the group of children. "I think we have several future mechanics in the making." Emma beamed with pride at somebody. "Jenny Williams wants to know if we can teach engine repair next month." Frank looked at Jenny, a shy 10-year-old, whose single mother worked 2 jobs to support 3 children. The kind of kid who might not have access to educational opportunities without programs like the one they'd created. "Engine repair is pretty advanced," Frank said seriously. "But we could start with basic maintenance. How to check oil levels, when to replace air filters, why regular maintenance prevents expensive problems." As the children dispersed to their various homes, chattering excitedly about carburetors and brake pads, Frank helped Emma clean up the tools they'd use for the demonstration. The garage behind their new house was larger than his old one, equipped with professional-grade equipment, but organized according to the same principles Emma had learned in the cramped space above Mitchell's auto repair. They'd kept the old garage, of course. Mrs. Patterson managed it now, with Frank stopping by 3 days a week to handle the more complex repairs. It had become something of a neighborhood institution, the place where people went not just for automotive service, but for the kind of honest advice that was increasingly rare in a world of corporate chains and profit maximization. "Victoria tells me you're thinking about expanding the teaching program," Frank said as he and Emma stored the jack and tire irons in their designated places. Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Mrs. Morrison thinks we could get approval to offer it as an after-school activity. Kids who are interested in mechanical stuff but don't have anywhere to learn about it." Frank studied his granddaughter's face, seeing in her enthusiasm the same passion for teaching and helping others that had guided his own life. At 11, Emma was already showing signs of becoming the kind of person who would make a positive difference in the world. "What do you think about that idea?" Emma asked. "I think it's brilliant. I also think you're going to need help if you want to teach a whole class of kids about automotive repair." Emma's eyes lit up. "You'd help me? Kiddo, I wouldn't miss it." As they walked back toward the house, Frank reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that rainy night when Victoria's car had broken down outside his old garage. The material improvements were obvious: the larger house, the financial security, the expansion of his business interests. But the deeper changes were more significant. He'd rediscovered the satisfaction of building something meaningful with someone he loved. He'd learned that integrity didn't require poverty, that success could be achieved without compromising values. Most importantly, he'd found that second chances at happiness were possible at any age if you remained open to unexpected possibilities. Victoria was waiting on the patio when Frank and Emma returned from the garage, her laptop open to what looked like financial spreadsheets. "Working on a Saturday afternoon?" Frank asked, settling into the chair beside her. Planning, actually. I've been thinking about what you said last week about eventually retiring from the day-to-day management of Sterling Industries." Frank had indeed suggested that Victoria consider stepping back from the CEO role as she approached 50, not because she wasn't capable of continuing, but because she'd expressed interest in focusing more time on education and community development. "Have you made any decisions?" Victoria closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I think I want to do it. Transition to chairman of the board, find someone younger to take over as CEO. Someone who shares our values but has fresh energy for the daily grind of corporate management." Emma looked up from her homework with interest. "What would you do instead?" "Well," Victoria said, glancing at Frank with a smile, "your father and I have been talking about starting a foundation. Something focused on vocational education and small business development, creating opportunities for people who want to learn trades or start their own companies." Frank felt a familiar warmth in his chest at the phrase "your father." Even after a year of marriage, he sometimes marveled at how seamlessly they'd become a family, how naturally Victoria had stepped into the role of mother to a child who desperately needed that kind of stability. "That sounds like a big project," Emma observed. "It would be," Victoria agreed, "but it's the kind of work that could make a real difference in people's lives. And it would give me more time to spend with you, helping with your teaching programs and whatever other brilliant ideas you come up with." As the afternoon faded into evening, the three of them settled into their familiar routine. Emma finished her homework while Frank prepared dinner, a skill he had improved significantly under Victoria's gentle guidance. Victoria reviewed reports from Sterling Industries, but with the relaxed attention of someone who no longer carried the weight of the company's survival on her shoulders. After dinner, they watched a movie together on the couch, Emma curled between the two adults in a configuration that had become their standard weekend arrangement. Frank marveled, as he often did, at how naturally they'd found their rhythm as a family, how completely Emma had embraced Victoria as a second parent, how seamlessly Victoria had adapted to the daily realities of raising a precocious 11-year-old. Later, after Emma had gone to bed, Frank and Victoria sat on the back porch enjoying the quiet of their neighborhood and the comfortable silence that had replaced the urgent conversations of their early relationship. "Do you ever regret it?" Victoria asked suddenly. Frank looked at her with surprise. "Regret what?" "This whole thing, the fake engagement that turned into a real marriage, the complications, the way your life changed so dramatically. Do you ever wish you'd just fixed my car that night and sent me on my way?" Frank considered the question seriously. There had certainly been challenges he couldn't have anticipated. The media attention during their engagement had been intrusive and sometimes unpleasant. Learning to navigate Victoria's social circle had required patience and occasional gritted teeth. The financial complexities of merging their very different lives had taken months to sort out. But set against those difficulties were the rewards he couldn't have imagined. The satisfaction of watching Victoria rediscover her confidence and sense of purpose. The joy of seeing Emma thrive in an environment where her intelligence was nurtured and celebrated. The unexpected pleasure of building something meaningful with a partner who shared his values. "No regrets," Frank said finally. "Well, maybe one." Victoria looked at him with concern. "What?" I regret that it took a crisis to bring us together. I regret that we needed to pretend to be in love before we figured out that we actually were in love. Frank reached for her hand, still wearing the simple engagement ring they'd chosen together for their fake engagement and never replaced. I wish we'd met under normal circumstances, had the chance to fall for each other the traditional way. Victoria smiled, leaning against his shoulder. I don't know. I think our way makes for a better story. We met when my car broke down and he helped me sounds much more romantic than we met at a charity auction and bonded over our mutual dislike of small talk. Frank laughed, remembering the charity auction that had been their first public appearance as an engaged couple. I still can't believe I spent $5,000 on a weekend at a spa. You didn't spend it, I did. And we never actually went to the spa weekend. Because you said the idea of being pampered by strangers sounded like torture. It does. I'd much rather spend a weekend teaching kids how to change their own oil. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into evening. Frank thought about the path that had brought them to this moment, a series of choices and chances that had seemed impossible to navigate at the time, but now felt inevitable in retrospect. Victoria, he said quietly, I love you. She looked up at him with the same surprise she'd shown the first time he'd said those words without an audience present, when they were no longer performing for anyone except themselves. I love you too, she replied. All of you. Your integrity, your kindness, your terrible jokes, your ability to fix anything that's broken. I couldn't fix your car that first night, Frank pointed out. You fixed something more important. You fixed my faith in people, my belief that there were still honest, decent human beings in the world. Victoria's voice grew serious. Frank, you saved my company, but more than that, you saved me. As they prepared for bed that night, Frank reflected on the conversation and the life they'd built together. In his previous marriage to Sarah, he'd learned that love was patient, that it grew stronger through shared challenges and daily kindnesses. With Victoria, he'd learned that love could also be surprising, that it could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances and prove more durable than anyone could have predicted. Standing at the window of their bedroom, looking out over the neighborhood where Emma would grow up, Frank felt a deep sense of gratitude for the series of events that had brought them together. A broken alternator belt, a frightened woman in the rain, a fake engagement that had become the foundation for the most genuine relationship of his life. Emma knocked on their bedroom door, a routine that had developed over the months since they'd become a family. Come in, kiddo, Frank called. Emma appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, carrying the stuffed elephant that had been her companion since her father's death. I just wanted to say goodnight, she said, accepting hugs from both adults, and to say thank you. Thank you for what? Victoria asked. For being happy, both of you. For making our family work. Emma's voice carried the serious tone she used when discussing important matters. I know it wasn't easy figuring out how to all live together, but I think we did a good job. Frank felt tears prick his eyes. At 11, Emma had already learned that families weren't just biological accidents, but deliberate creations that required effort and intention and love. We did do a good job, he agreed, and we're going to keep doing a good job. After Emma returned to her room, Frank and Victoria settled into bed with the comfortable routine of a couple who had learned each other's rhythms and preferences. But as Victoria drifted off to sleep beside him, Frank remained awake for a while longer, thinking about the path that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, he'd been a widowed grandfather trying to provide stability for a grieving child while running a struggling business. His goals had been simple: keep Emma safe, keep the garage profitable, and maintain the integrity that had been his father's greatest gift. Now he was a husband and father again, a partner in one of Colorado's most successful companies, a teacher and mentor to children throughout his community. His goals had expanded, but remained fundamentally the same: take care of the people he loved, build something meaningful, and never compromise the values that defined who he was. The fake engagement that had started as a desperate attempt to save Victoria's company had become the foundation for a real life together, a partnership that balanced ambition with authenticity, success with service. They'd learned that the best relationships weren't built on compatibility alone, but on shared commitment to something larger than themselves. As Frank finally drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the quiet sounds of his family's peaceful rest, He thought about the lesson that had guided him through every major decision of his adult life. Good people should help each other. Sometimes that help came in small gestures, fixing a stranger's car, offering shelter from a storm, listening without judgment when someone needed to be heard. And sometimes if you were very fortunate that help evolved into something deeper and more lasting. Sometimes helping someone else became the path to saving yourself and discovering that the love you'd thought was performance had been authentic all along. In the morning, there would be new challenges to face, new opportunities to seize, new ways to make a positive difference in the world. But for now, Frank Mitchell was exactly where he belonged. Home with the family he'd built through intention and love, ready to face whatever came next with the confidence that came from knowing who he was and what he stood for. The story had begun with a broken-down car and a stranger in need. It had become something neither of them could have imagined, a love story disguised as a business arrangement, a family created through choice rather than chance. A reminder that the best things in life often came not when you were looking for them, but when you were busy being the kind of person who deserved to find them. And there you have it, Frank and Victoria's incredible journey from a broken-down car on a rainy night to building a love that conquered corporate boardrooms and family legacies. What started as a desperate fake engagement became something far more precious, a real partnership built on trust, integrity, and the courage to fight for what matters most. Frank's story proves that it's never too late for a second chance at love, that a man's character isn't measured by his bank account, but by how he treats people when no one's watching, and that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards if you have the courage to take them. Victoria discovered that real strength isn't about controlling every outcome. It's about finding someone worthy of your trust and building something together that's stronger than what either of you could achieve alone. Together, they showed us that the best partnerships aren't based on what you can get from each other, but on what you're willing to give. And Emma, she reminded us that families aren't just born, they're chosen, nurtured, and built through daily acts of love, even when the world tries to tear them apart. If Frank and Victoria's story touched your heart, if you believe that good people deserve second chances, and that integrity always wins in the end, hit that like button and tell us in the comments, what would you risk everything for? Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because tomorrow we have another powerful story about love, family, and the courage to start over when life gives you an unexpected second chance. Until next time, remember Frank's father's wisdom: a man's reputation is built one honest act at a time. You never know which act of kindness might change your life forever. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow with another story that celebrates the values that make life worth living.